Once upon a time, there was a show called Star Trek. It got cancelled after 3 seasons, but did well enough on replays that we got movies out of it, and that eventually gave us Star Trek The Next Generation, which started off bumpy but then got better and successful. And then somewhere along the way, someone decided to do another Star Trek show, but this time on a space station instead of a spaceship, and that gave us Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
This show is the drizzling shits. I don't think anyone should be watching it.
It was a good show that took place on a space station. It had a black captain long before black captains were the cool hip thing. There was conflict between the main cast which made them interesting, and there was groundwork for some pretty interesting stories waiting to be told. And then the Dominion showed up and completely shit the bed. War tends to do that, you know, but that's another story. So as with anything that got popular or anything associated with a popular thing, DS9 got their obligatory video game tie-in, hence today's subject matter, Star Trek Deep Space Nine Crossroads of Time, released in 1995 for both Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis from Playmates. Today we're focusing on the Genesis version since that's the first version of the game that I've played, and while I considered giving the Super NES version a mild look, it's more or less the same game with a few more musical tracks and not much else, so we could set that aside for the well of reviews later down the road that I could recycle when I can't think of anything else at the moment. DS9 has you assuming control of Commander Benjamin Sisko, fresh-faced commanding officer of Space Station Deep Space Nine, who apparently runs around the station like a crazed madman when things go off the rails. I must have missed that episode of DS9. Taking place during the latter half of the first season, not that it means anything really, the game boasts a handful of sizable levels, and there's a password system in place where you're given a new password every few segments. Nice and simple too. You only have one life, but unlimited continues. More than enough to keep you going at least, if you want to. Unique for a Star Trek game, this is a side-scroller much in the vein of games like Prince of Persia or Flashback as far as how it controls, but here you're playing as the Sisko before he became the Sisko, and why the fuck did I write that line? For fuck's Jesus Christ. Anyway, it's a side-scroller. Sisko runs a lot, he jumps, he can grab onto ledges of platforms, and he can pick up items and keep them in an inventory. He cannot take long drops, or he'll either take heavy damage or he just dies, and we have no more TV show. He also does not control all that well. Just moving around and fumbling with the inventory system is a pain in the ass. You have to hold down the A button and use left and right to cycle through items one by one. It's a somewhat cumbersome implementation and one of many things that contributes to controls being a mess, as well as being somewhat unresponsive at times. And really, that's honestly the bulk of the game's issues, and the game doesn't quite take that into account with its level design. No better example of this is given than in the game's very first level, which tasks you with seeking out detonators throughout several segments of cavernous cargo holds and disposing them before time runs out, resulting in the station exploding, and thus we have no more TV show. The level requires you ride turbo platforms along a rail system and operate transporter systems to beam said platforms from one rail to another before eventually forcing you to take your chances with the awkward platforming controls. It's probably one of the most irritating first levels I've played in any video game, and does a fine job of exposing the game's glaring issues rather than ease the player into its mechanics so that they'd be better prepared for further challenges down the road. Speaking of later down the road, you'll encounter other challenges in other levels, such as a flashback mission on your old ship, the Saratoga, where you're fighting Borg, or a rescue mission that involves spelunking in some Bajoran caves that are eventually set on fire, thus predicting the series finale. Sorry if I spoiled the movie for anybody. There's some platforming bits, some mild puzzle-solving elements, and even a bit of action, but it's ultimately all hindered by the poor controls. It's not a condemnation of the style of platformer employed, because it's worked well in other games like the aforementioned Prince and Flashback games, but it simply does not work here, and quite frankly, it's a bit of a shame. As mentioned, you're mostly playing as Commander Sisko throughout the majority of the game, but Crossroads of Times will occasionally throw you a bone unless you play as other characters such as Odo and his ability to turn into a little vole thing, or Dr. Bashir conversing with other characters, though they mostly play the same, and seeing Bashir run around like a crazed madman doesn't quite give off that same effect, especially if you're familiar with the character's backstory. If not, I refer you to an episode of the 5th season called Dr. Bashir, I presume, which also features the guy who created the Voyager EMH. Have fun with that. There's also a scrolling shooter level where you have to navigate the wormhole and a runabout before chasing down and escaping Rogue Bajoran, who is responsible for all those bombs you have to collect. This isn't all that great either, but it's something different, I guess. You know, I make a stink about the game not controlling or playing all that well, and that's my only real quibble with the DS9 game, because if you fix that part up a bit, this could have been somewhat decent at least. A Star Trek side-scroller might not be the most natural thing to be conceived, but the style of play adopted by DS9 has been proven in the past, and there is some care put into this package in some other places. The dialogue between the characters, for example, could easily pass for something that could fit within the context of the show. You know, it's true to the characters for the most part. It gets some minutiae right, such as the Borg adapting to your phaser fire after a couple of shots, and even Morn is there, as talkative as ever. Game looks pretty good too. The DS9 sets look pretty close to how they look on the show, though they probably missed a trick by not having the levels wrap as you're running. The station is basically several large circles, so you could easily have done that where it would have made sense. Just, you know, run around the level and just keep running in circles, but they didn't do that, whatever. It would have been a nice, neat little thing. I do like that if you stop after running a long stretch, you'll actually catch your breath before being all stoic. It's a nice touch. Even the Saratoga stages look pretty good, even if they're using the TNG settings as a basis for the aesthetics. The other levels are okay looking at best and blah as worst. Lots of earth tones. Let's just put it that way. If there is one quibble to be had, it's that the sprites are perhaps a bit too big. Not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, the sprites are fairly detailed and you do recognize the various characters, but usually large sprites means a smaller field of vision, which means many possible leaps of faith for the emissary of the prophets, and considering how poor the controls are, that's not a good thing by any means. Other than that, it looks fine. Sounds not too bad either, I suppose. You have a mildly respectable rendition of the DS9 theme playing on the title screen, and a rather funky soundtrack to follow that isn't from the show obviously, but I don't mind because I kinda like these tunes, they're a good listen. On the Super Nintendo at least. Here they sound a bit tinny and not quite high quality, the lower tier of Genesis musical compositions as it were, but I dig the tunes so I don't mind it too much. Sound effects are a bit of a mixed bag. You have some rough-sounding interpretations of familiar Star Trek sound effects, and some other sound effects that are decidedly not Star Trek. But it doesn't matter because they all sound kinda meh anyways. It's just something you have to put up with these early console games before they were able to rip off the actual sounds and use them as they were, so whatever. It's the best they could do, I guess. Star Trek Deep Space Nine Crossroads of Time is a flawed game, but I don't know if I'd go so far to say that it's a bad game, because while it might not play like it, this is a game that had some care put into it, recreating the sets as best as they could, getting the characters down, trying to put together a somewhat compelling narrative that could easily fit within the dynamics of the first season at least. There was something there that, maybe with a little more polish and a little more of a retooling, might not have been a masterpiece of Trek gaming, but there would have been something to sate the console Trekkie / Trekker / I don't give a fuck / get a life as it were. But the gameplay itself is what hurts it, and kinda brings the whole thing down a notch or two. With that said, it is mildly playable at least, and if you're willing to put up with DS9's quirks and nibbles, as it were, it might be worth a play or two. But ultimately, Star Trek Deep Space Nine Crossroads of Time misses the mark, and I suppose I could end this with some quippy DS9 quote, but I can't think of any at the moment, and quite frankly, it's not really worth the effort, so I'm not just gonna end it. Bye.